On July 15, 1954, in New Orleans, Louisiana, Lucien Palin finds a voodoo doll at his bedside. The attempts to get rid of it destroyed his life. In a room on the 5th floor of St. Mary's Hospital in New Orleans, the atmosphere clung like a second skin, suffocating yet strangely detached. The walls, painted a pale blue so faded they seemed to retreat from the very concept of color. Tubes and wires made a maze over Lucien Palin's body, each leading to machines that beeped and hummed in a mechanical rhythm, a synthetic lullaby that promised no comfort. The air conditioner came to life at erratic intervals, spitting out bursts of cold air as if reluctant to offer even this minor relief. Through a single window, closed as if to quarantine the room from the outside world, fragments of jazz melodies floated up from the busy street below. It was late afternoon, and the sun painted long, dark shadows on the wall like eerie precursors to the approaching dusk. Lucien, middle-aged with deep-set eyes that seemed to contain whole worlds of sorrow, lay paralyzed in the hospital bed. His inability to move made the room's chilling sterility feel like a grim joke. His once black hair, now shot through with strands of gray, lay flat against the pillow. His eyes were the only part of him that moved freely, and they followed the young nurse as she entered the room. She hesitated at the threshold, clutching her clipboard like a shield. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the room. She was new to the ward, early 20s and visibly unprepared for the disquieting atmosphere that seemed to envelop Lucien. Her scrubs were spotlessly white, contrasting sharply with her brunette hair and the haunting backdrop of the room. She carried a small notebook where she scribbled observations, musings, anything to make the labyrinth of her daily routine seem navigable. As she moved about the room, adjusting Lucien's IV and jotting down numbers from the machines, her eyes drifted towards the bedside table. Unlike the other patients' tables adorned with photos and flowers, Lucien's held only a single unsettling item, a voodoo doll. The room seemed to tighten around her. "Mr. Palin, may I ask you a personal question?" She tried to keep her voice steady, but quivered with fear and curiosity. Lucien's eyes flickered, a haunting blend of relief and dread. "What do you want to know?" His voice was barely audible, as if each syllable cost him physical pain. "Your room. It's so empty. Where is everyone? Your family? Your friends?" Her voice trembled at the last words. As soon as they escaped her lips, she regretted the unprofessionalism, the vulnerability. A beep from the machines cut through the room's heavy atmosphere like a knife. Lucien's oxygen levels had dipped suddenly. Panicked, she scanned the monitors for any signs of malfunction. There were none. The young nurse realized that the hospital's 5th floor was about to get another haunting tale. It's been decades, yet that day still vividly affects me. Our final days were filled with arguments that seemed to arise from nowhere and everywhere. I felt cornered and suffocated. Her love had become a cage. It didn't help that I struggled to find work, muddling the days with a growing dread. We both felt it. Something had shifted. We had grown apart. So, I made the most painful decision of my life. I told Anna it was over. I still hear the cracking in her voice, the tears that filled those dark eyes. But I knew, deep down, it was the right thing to do. I needed to breathe, and I felt like I was drowning. When news reached me that Anna had taken her own life, leaving behind a note addressed to me, it was like the ground had slipped beneath my feet. I simply did not have the courage to read it. I was too afraid of what I might read. I dismissed it as a final act of drama in a relationship brimming with it. That New Orleans summer seemed like an echo of my inner turmoil. The air was almost tactile, thick and sultry. Trees whispered to each other in the swaying wind, like old men sharing secrets at a corner pub. The mingled scent of jasmine and sea air would catch in your lungs as if breathing in the essence of the world's joy and sorrow. 5 years passed. I had moved on, or so I thought. Now, with Clara, the only person who helped me to move on from Anna's death, I was carving out a different life, and yet the past refused to be buried. One balmy evening, as I walked into our shared bedroom, there it was, a voodoo doll lying innocently on the bedside table. It was a spitting image of me, down to the hazel eyes and the slightly receding hairline. The miniature suit it wore resembled one hanging in my closet. Dismissing it as a silly prank or some twisted toy, I threw the doll in the trash can. From that day on, something felt off. Objects would move slightly, whispers seemed to echo in rooms where no one stood, and Anna's perfume would waft into my nostrils at the most unlikely moments. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, I refused to entertain the notion that something supernatural was at play. I even convinced myself that Clara must pull some elaborate joke on me to lighten our often mundane routine. And the voodoo doll would somehow reappear in places I hadn't put it. First, it was the bathroom shelf, staring at me with button eyes as I brushed my teeth. Then, the kitchen table, tucked between the salt and pepper shakers as if it had joined us for a meal. I tried throwing it away, burying it, even burning it. But it would always return as if tethered to me by some invisible string. I never took it too seriously, and always dismissed it by assuming it was my forgetfulness. Clara thought the doll was funny at first. "Did you get it as a joke?" she asked. Clara, so full of life and laughter, was the one who found the doll amusing, she said, her voice dripping with playful sarcasm. But as she reached for her fork to prick the doll by saying, "Is this how you plan to keep me in line?" she laughed. But hardly 15 minutes passed, and something awful happened. She gripped her throat, ears widening. She looked at me, horror filling her face, and then she collapsed. Just like that, she was gone. No scream, no last words, just an awful, ringing silence. The heaviness of the moment was beyond words. It was like a layer of dark fog had settled over everything, choking out the warmth, the laughter, the life we had shared. From that moment, my life started unraveling like a spool of thread pulled too hard and fast. A month had passed, and I was still grieving Clara's death while contemplating 1,000 more ways to get rid of this doll with no success. In the whirlpool of misery that had become my life, one person came to mind for help: Harold. He and I had gone to college together, and he was a bit of an odd duck, always buried in mysterious old books about the occult. And so, in my desperate state, my mind drifted to him as a potential savior. We chose to meet at a quiet bar downtown. It was a place where dim lights flickered, casting a warm glow on old wood and leather. The comforting sound of a jazz band played in the background, cushioning our entrance. People were laughing, their faces lit with joy, glasses chinking in a merry dance of toasts and stories. But as soon as I began my story, something in the bar shifted. It was subtle at first, almost invisible. The laughter and joy of the crowd felt like it was ebbing away, replaced by an oppressive, all-encompassing silence. Our corner felt isolated, like we were in a bubble of our own. Harold listened intently, his face a mask of concentration. When I finished, there was a long pause. He looked deep in thought, a frown creasing his usually relaxed features. Finally, he leaned in closer, and in a voice so soft I had to strain to hear, he whispered, "Esmeralda, I blinked, taken aback. Who? Esmeralda, he repeated, looking around nervously as if saying the name too loudly might invoke some spirit. She's the one you need to see. If anyone can help with this, he motioned vaguely around him. It's her. His eyes had a curious glint, a mix of excitement and fear, but his certainty, his unwavering belief in Esmeralda, gave me a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she held the answers to the dark cloud that had enveloped my life. We left the bar, and I began my journey towards Esmeralda's home. Esmeralda's place was eerie, filled with old stuff you'd find in a grandma's attic. Everything was just a bit off, and I felt my skin crawl. She started chanting words I didn't know. The room got dark, like a cloud had passed over the sun. But we were inside. The walls seemed to talk back to her, and things got really bad. A shadow showed up, just floating there. Everything shook, and a scream filled the air, making my bones feel like they would crack. Then Esmeralda stopped chanting. She looked at me. Her face was a mess of feelings. "It's done," she said. I left feeling both lighter and heavier. A problem had been solved, but I knew more problems would come. But then Esmeralda's face went white, like she'd seen a ghost. "I couldn't do it," she said, shaking. "Anna did something called a two-heart spell. You can't break that." The walls seemed to squeeze me. It felt like the air was sucked out of the room. "So what now?" I asked, already knowing I wouldn't like the answer. "You're stuck," she said, looking at me like she was sorry for me. "The bad stuff won't stop. It's not just a bunch of scary moments. It's your life now." I felt small, like I was being pushed into a tiny box. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. There was no way out. 2 weeks had passed since that heavy moment in Esmeralda's room. I finally decided it was time to read Anna's note, knowing it would either make things better or worse, but if worse, probably way worse. It read, "Love is stronger than death, Lucien. I'll find my way back to your heart. You belong with me." I was taken by both guilt and rage. It felt like the world had turned its back on me, and I knew I was alone in this never-ending nightmare. I was frustrated, and I wanted to get rid of that doll. I found myself next to a swamp late at night. It was the kind of darkness where even the moon seemed to hide. My hand shook as I threw the doll into the dirty water. For a moment, a small part of me felt free. I went home thinking maybe, just maybe, I'd beaten the dark magic. Sleep took me quickly that night. I didn't dream of twisted faces or hear whispers in the dark for the first time in weeks. I felt peace. It was almost like the curse was gone. But when the bright rays of the rising sun met with my face, there it was. The doll, bone dry, smiling at me like it knew a secret I didn't. The next day, the doorbell echoed through the sprawling mansion, pulling me away from thoughts that had long ceased to be companions and had turned into tormentors. I opened the door, and there she stood, Rachel, Anna's cousin. A face I hadn't seen since we buried Anna. My heart stumbled. As she stepped into the threshold, her eyes met mine, penetrating as if drilling for secrets deep within me. I hesitated but couldn't turn her away. Memories of Anna rushed back, a torrent of regret and guilt. I stepped aside, opening the door wider. Rachel's heels clicked ominously against the marble floor as she followed me through the hallway. We passed frames capturing frozen moments of Anna's radiant smiles, her eyes full of a life that was no longer. Rachel smirked at the photographs. An icy chill crawled up my spine. I led her into the drawing room, sensing but not seeing the agenda she hid behind her composed face. I moved to offer her a drink, aiming to bring a bottle of wine from the cabinet. But before I could reach it, Rachel caught my attention. With an unsettling grace, she picked up the voodoo doll that sat innocuously on a side table among trinkets. I froze. My heart began to race for reasons I couldn't explain. From her purse, she retrieved a small, ornate box. It snapped open to reveal pins twisted into shapes, each darker than the night outside. Her eyes narrowed, and her fingers delicately crossed the doll's fingertips. She pricked it. The pain was immediate, a kind of agony I'd never known. My fingertips felt like they were bursting from the inside, detonating in a silent, invisible explosion. I dropped the bottle of wine. It shattered, the red liquid splattering like blood across the hardwood floor. Rachel didn't waste a moment. Her hands moved to a new set of pins, thicker this time. With a twisted enjoyment, she jammed them into the doll's eyes. My world crumbled into darkness. It was as if my eyes had collapsed inward, pulling me down into a vortex of suffering. I screamed, but there was no one to hear. All light was snuffed out, leaving only a terrifying void. I sensed her reach for another pin, sharp and thin. I felt it before I heard it, a sharp, deafening explosion inside my ears. Pain radiated from the core of my head, vibrating through every nerve, every cell of my being. I clutched my ears and crumpled to the floor, my knees hitting the wood with a dull thud. My skull felt like it was cracking open, each echo of the explosion amplifying the unbearable agony. Rachel was relentless. Her face, a still pool, betrayed no emotion as she pulled out a needle and thread. I felt it as she started stitching the doll's mouth shut. My lips felt like they were being pierced by molten metal. I tasted the iron tang of blood in my mouth. I tried to scream, but the words got caught in a throat constricted by panic. The flesh of my lips felt like it was tearing apart. I gagged on my blood, the life draining out of me in thick, warm spurts. There I was, trapped in my own home, my sanctuary turned into a chamber of torture. The air grew thicker, the darkness consuming what was left of my senses. Rachel's vengeance had reached its peak, a crescendo of torment and despair. I was left in a twisted heap on the floor, my world now an endless, agonizing darkness. I felt Rachel take a longer pin, and my body tensed for the next round of torment. She didn't rush. The pin pressed into the doll's spine, and instantly my own back arched as if pulled by invisible strings. The sensation was unimaginable, like each bone in my spine was being split open and rearranged. Pain surged from my neck to my lower back, each spot a new epicenter of agony. My vision went fuzzy as I fought to breathe through the monstrous pain enveloping my back. My body shook violently, unable to bear the sensation of being taken apart, joint by joint. Everything in me wanted to fade, to escape this realm of torment. My mind hovered on the brink of unconsciousness, flirting with the sweet relief it offered. Within seconds, my eyes closed, and final tears poured through my face. I woke up surrounded by sterile white walls, tubes in my arms, and machines humming softly. It felt like I'd been lifted out of a furnace of torture, only to be dropped into some cold medical purgatory. The doctors walked in, brows furrowed, eyes filled with puzzlement. No one could explain why I was paralyzed or the brutal pain that had consumed me. Tests showed nothing. Technically, I could walk, but my suffering was too real to be imaginary. I tried to consult almost every medical professional in this city, but my cure was beyond the knowledge of medical science. After listening to my story, the nurse offered to throw away the doll for me. "Maybe it'll break the curse," she said. I warned her vehemently, "Don't touch it. You have no idea what it's capable of." She looked startled but nodded, probably thinking I'd lost my mind. The nurse left, and the door clicked softly behind her, sealing me in my chamber of horrors. My eyes shifted back to the drawer beside my bed, knowing that within it lay the embodiment of my eternal torment. I could feel it, waiting, biding its time until it would strike again. And as I lay there, helpless and alone, I understood that the doll would never leave me. It was an entity of darkness, forever tethered to my existence, patiently awaiting its next chance to unleash its terrible might. Please subscribe and click the notification button for the next scary horror story.